You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Disease Du Jour podcast. I'm your host, Carly Sisson, and in this episode, Dr. Julia Felippe joined me to review the equine immune system. The Disease Du Jour podcast is brought to you by Merck Animal Health. Dr. Felippe received her veterinary degree from São Paulo State University campus Botucatu, Brazil in 1989 and pursued equine medicine in her native country before an internship and residency in equine internal medicine at Kansas State University. She is board certified by the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine. She has a Master of Science degree from Kansas State University and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in Immunology and Immunogenetics from Cornell University. She has been a faculty at Cornell University College of Veterinary Medicine since 2002 and runs a research program studying equine developmental immunology and immunodeficiencies as the head of the Equine Immunology Laboratory. She also serves as the executive director of the Cornell Veterinary Educators Academy and the vice president of the Veterinary and Comparative Clinical Immunology Society. Thank you, Dr. Felippe, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to meet you and be with your audience.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited to hear your insight on this topic. Can you get us started by providing just a general overview of the equine immune system and its primary components?
The immune system of the horse is quite comparable with what we know about the human immune system. We identify the similar elements of the immune system with actually quite comparable functions as well. And that has helped us, of course, advance what we know about the equine immune system because we collect information from humans and rodents particularly. But the immune system of the horse does have some differences, some of them associated with how the immune system develops during gestation and in the early months of life. And of course, specific diseases that the horse has, some of them shared by humans, but the mechanisms of disease might be triggered by different environmental components. So those things can make the immune response a little bit different amongst those species. But overall, the immune system of the horse comprises what we call the innate immune system and the adapted immune system. The innate immune system being a part of the immune system that has tools to promptly respond to the presence of pathogens or allergens that might encounter the host. And the adapted immune system having a more elaborate transformation or the differentiation, we should say, that increases the specificity for a certain trigger, allergen or antigen, and with the potential of developing memory. So examples of cells that comprise that are part of the immune system are the phagocytes, cells that are responsible for detecting and removing and killing pathogens. And examples of cells that are part of the adapted immune system are lymphocytes, cells, the B cells and T cells that carry receptors on the cell surface that detect specific sequences or processed proteins that allows them to become activated and differentiated into cells that have a specific target with a high affinity for that target.
So can you talk a little bit about humoral immunity in horses and the role that antibodies play in this type of immunity and the role of vaccines as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing about the humoral immunity in horses is that the humoral immunity is primarily provided by differentiation of B cells. Although these cells needed to be activated to become differentiated and produce antibodies, those are the cells that have the responsibility of producing those antibodies. And B cells develop during gestation. and they actually expand as a population with a quite reasonable diversity in their receptors, their B cell receptors. And their B cell receptors carry an immunoglobulin or an antibody. So our B cell carries throughout its life an antibody or an immunoglobulin structure with a certain specificity for their matching target. And that, as I said, happened already during gestation with a high productivity. And this stage of differentiation happens in different tissues in the fetal life, but primarily in the bone marrow. And so when the foal is born, it has what we call this pre-immune repertoire of B cells that can produce antibodies that match to a large number of targeting sequences of structures. And but what happens also is that because the foal is naive to those antigens at birth, those B cells needed to go through cycles of differentiation to increase the population that recognizes specific antigens or pathogens, and then increase the affinity of their receptors for those specific pathogens to create the best antibody for that specific pathogen. So that takes time. But once it is elaborated, antibodies are really important in several functions. One of them, for instance, is neutralizing pathogens. So they do not bind to receptors on cells that allow their infection and expansion, right? Proliferation. So antibodies can block the infection right at the beginning, if you will, once it has a great affinity for pathogens. The other function antibodies do is facilitating phagocytosis. In fact, they are essential for an efficient phagocytosis, so removal of pathogens, and their killing. So neutrophils and macrophages are dependent on those on those antibodies heavily for efficient phagocytosis and killing. Antibodies allow natural killer cells to kill infected cells, so a mechanism that helps to protect the host after infection occurred. And antibodies also activate complement, which kills pathogens very, very efficiently. So complement activation is a good mechanism to kill pathogens. And then finally, it can activate mast cells and to initiate inflammatory processes that facilitate trafficking of inflammatory cells and activity of inflammatory cells. So antibodies are triggers of inflammation as well in some instances. So the combination of function of antibodies it really covers a lot of ground in the immune system and interact with other cells for their function too. Therefore, the importance in vaccines eliciting a humoral or antibody protection is important, because vaccines facilitate this process that I just described and allow the antibodies to participate in many mechanisms of protection. And more importantly, vaccines are safe in that regard. So we can protect an individual even before the exposure to pathogens, improving that ahead of time and preventing disease or preventing the infection per se.
Today's Disease Du Jour podcast is brought to you by Merck Animal Health's Protozel 1.56% diclazerol anti-protozoal pellets. Get the scoop on Protozel easy-to-administer top dress alfalfa pellets. A safe and effective treatment that starts working fast without a loading dose. Learn more at merckanimalhealthusa.com. Do not use Protozil in horses with known hypersensitivity to diclazeril. Safety has not been studied in breeding, pregnant, or lactating horses. For complete safety information, please read label. What are some of the key components of innate immunity in horses, and how do they protect the horse against pathogens?
Yeah, so as I mentioned briefly before, the innate immunity is an area of the immune system that is prepared to act right away. So if there is a threat in the body, let's say caused by pathogens, the cells of the innate immune system, named neutrophils and macrophages, they are equipped to first recognize the presence of those pathogens, and then secondly, to remove them by phagocytosis and killing them intracellularly, to eliminate their ability to infect other cells and expand in the body. So the way phagocytes recognize the presence of pathogens is by the ligand of their receptors. So phagocytes have receptors known as toll-like receptors that can bind to pathogen structures, no pathogen-associated molecular patterns that have a fit for those receptors. And when those patterns bind to the receptor, that triggers intracellular activation pathways that signal the nucleus to transcribe and translate proteins that are important for immune activation, such as cytokines. So it is very common, for instance, for a neutrophil, after phagocytizing a pathogen, to produce inflammatory cytokines such as TNF-alpha, IL-6, IL-1, and those cytokines will communicate with other cells and increase and expand the immune response through that pathway. The interesting aspect of the toll-like receptors is that phagocytes have different types of toll-like receptors that can recognize different pathogen-associated patterns. Therefore, it increases its ability to recognize many different types of pathogens and microorganisms through similar receptors. So that's a strategy that the immune system developed to amplify that ability of recognition and activation. Phagocytes also have other different types of mechanisms that they use for phagocytosis. One I described was the one mediated by antibodies, and that uses what we call a receptor called the Fc gamma receptor. There are also complement receptors on the cell surface that allow phagocytosis of complement-bound pathogens. There are receptors for inflammatory cytokines that exacerbate the activation of these phagocytes, and mechanisms of endocytosis too. So this is a cell that have different types of mechanisms to accomplish similar outcome, which is removal of pathogens from the environment. And then lastly, we have one cell called dendritic cell, which is also a phagocyte. But the importance of dendritic cell is to detect the presence of pathogens using similar mechanisms in the peripheral tissues and bring this pathogen information to the regional lymph nodes of the body. And by bringing these pathogens and processing them, dendritic cells now can activate T cells to start their activation and expansion, so the adapted immune system can develop. So dendritic cells have this important role of phagocytosis, but with the primary role of activating the adapted immune system through the activation of T cells.
Now, what is cell-mediated immunity? Can you walk us through that a little bit too?
Yeah, so the cell-mediated immunity comes from the activation and expansion of T cells. So whereas B cells are responsible for the humoral part of the immune system with the production of antibodies, the cell-mediated immunity is on the shoulders of T cells. And we have primarily two types of T cells, the CD4 T cells and the CD8 T cells. The CD4 T cells are known as helper T cells because they play a major role of helping and also functioning as a checkpoint of immune responses. So these cells, the CD4 T cells, interact with the B cells and also with CD8 T cells. And CD4 T cells, they can differentiate in different types of cells. In the horse, we know primarily the TH1, TH2, and the TH17 CD4 T cells. We have quite a bit of knowledge of these three types of cells. And TH1 CD4 T cells are cells that are characterized by their interferon gamma production and the activation of cell-mediated cytotoxicity, particularly by CD8 T cells. So these are a type of cells that reinforce the activation and expansion of CD8 T cells for the killing of infected cells with intracellular pathogens, such as viruses or some intracellular bacteria. The CD4 T cells are cells that help the humoral response of the immune system, and they allow B cells differentiate rapidly upon antigen encounter, and also serve as checkpoints for B cell differentiation. So trying not to develop autoimmune diseases, if you will, with B cell production of antibodies that can harm self molecules. So they're very important in those mechanisms of B cell differentiation and checking for autoimmunity as well. They also play a major role in allergies, for instance, and in hypersensitivities mediated by antibodies. The TH17 cells are cells that tend to exacerbate or promote inflammatory responses by neutrophils. They play a role in many inflammatory processes in the body system, and sometimes in overreacting inflammatory responses, such as asthma. And but they're very important in triggering the inflammatory response to allow arrival, and activation of the inflammatory cells at the site that they are needed.
So, what are some strategies that veterinarians can use to manage and support immune health in horses?
Yeah, so I think basically a good immune system relies on at least three aspects. One is a balanced nutrition, the control of stress, and a clean environment. So I think those three elements can really support well the function and the cells of the immune system. So I would say that nowadays, adequate nutrition is readily available for horses. Some horses rely on their pasture or hay for nutrition, with perhaps some supplementation of minerals and vitamins that are important for the function of cells and body systems. But just in a balanced way, just the minimum requirements, if you will, would also supply what the immune cells would need. Control of stress, to me, is one big factor. Horses are become quite stressful during transportation, when they join new herds, or when they are in intensive conditioning exercise. So in those conditions, it would have been nice to have some kind of planning to minimize stress For instance, having a plan for transportation in which the horses are used to the type of trailer, having enough resting period in very long trips, having water and food available periodically during those trips, and then also having a plan for acclimatizing this horse to a new herd and a new environment. So there is a process in place that allows adaptation without much stress. And then finally, as far as conditioning goes, elaborate on a conditional program in which there are periods of there are resting periods where energy can be recovered, and also recovered from the stress of exercise, and keep the health of the animal. So I think balance in all three elements is important: a nutritional balance in nutrition, balance in types of stress, and balance in conditioning. And then finally, a clean environment. Environments that are either too dry or too wet, they can cause different types of diseases, facilitate infectious processes or allergic processes. So having well-ventilated areas in areas that are not too wet or too dry would help the overall health of the horse. And avoid overcrowded environment too. Overcrowding really affects how clean the environment is, and can also facilitate the transmission of infectious diseases. So those would be elements that can help overall the function of the immune system.
Yeah, thank you for that great overview. Are there any recent advancements in research in equine immunology that might impact veterinary practice that you might be able to share? Anything up and coming that's interesting?
Yeah, I would say that the knowledge about the immune system of the horse is progressing very, very fast. Either as a general knowledge, as for instance, what we know today about how the immune system develops during gestation and in the first months of life in foals, to the immunology of pregnancy, to response to vaccines in horses, and the development of specific conditions that involve primarily the immune system, such as allergies, and immunodeficiencies. So we are progressing very, very fast. One of the reasons for this progress comes from the learning about the genome of the horse, which allows us to understand how genes are expressed, mechanisms of expression of genes, and how we can use how we can detect that expression to characterize diseases and diagnose conditions in the horse, or even identify mutations that are responsible for specific diseases. So the horse genome has really helped us advancing our overall knowledge about the immune system. The vaccinology and the technology behind vaccines also is helping the development of vaccines for horses. Horses are, the use of vaccines in horses is something that we've been doing for decades with great efficiency. But I would say that there are some diseases still that are a threat to the horse population and the horse health that we still need to advance more, such as effective vaccines for equine herpes virus, for instance. So I think we are building on our knowledge about what we know of the mechanisms of disease and what kind of vaccines can be developed to stop the organism from activation, infection, and proliferation. But we still need to move forward on that and come up with an efficient vaccine. But we now can, better identify conditions of immunodeficiency in the horse because we understand better the clinical science behind them, and we have some tests that can help characterizing immunodeficiencies, particularly of the adult horse. There is one immunodeficiency specifically known as common variable immunodeficiency, which is a condition in horses that characterized by their inability to produce antibodies. And as I mentioned before, antibodies play a major role in immune protection. So without antibodies, these horses are quite vulnerable to infections, particularly with bacteria. So we now understand a little bit better this disease, and we have some tools to identify them. We're also learning about delayed or transient immunodeficiencies of the growing horse during their first or second year of life. By understanding these transient conditions, we can support these individuals a little better during that developmental stage. These tend to be transient conditions, so they tend to grow out of it, but they do need some support during that phase, and we now recognize how we can do that as well. Tremendous advancements in understanding asthma, skin, diseases related to hypersensitivities or allergies. So I think we are moving fast with the field of equine immunology, both at the basic knowledge, but also about disease-driven knowledge. And I think we've been able to help our horses better more recently with some important goals for the future.
Well, great. This has been such a nice overview of the immune system. Do you have anything else you'd like to add on the topic before we wrap up?
If you have more interest in learning about immunology in veterinary medicine, including horses, you may want to look at the website for the veterinary Clinical and Comparative Immunology Society that has a great program with monthly seminars and presentations throughout the year that can, give some current information about diseases and how the immune system is involved in those diseases, and also treatment that use the immune system to or control the immune system or exacerbate or promote the immune system response for the well-being of the animals. So that's my suggestion. It's a nice group of clinical immunologists, but also practitioners with interest in the immune system.
Great. I will leave that website linked in the show notes, so anybody who's listening and wants to check it out, you can find it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Felippe, for joining us today, and thank you so much to our audience for listening, and a very special thank you to our sponsor, Merck Animal Health. If you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, please send me an email at csisson@equinenetwork.com. That's CSISSON@equinenetwork.com.